Well, let me follow up on that, because I always thought that war was about acquiring territory, but in this case it seemed to be invade, loot, burn down everything in sight, and then often as much leave. What was that all about?
Well, it's not the policy of the U.S. government to go in and burn and loot and leave. But the problem was they would come across, they have raw troops. They have not had proper training. A lot of these people had been on the farm the month before. You give them a gun, you put them out into Canada, they're badly fed, they're badly led, they don't have training, they don't have discipline, they think to be an American man means never to take orders from anybody. And then you say, now you have to take orders, and they're not very keen on that idea. And their idea about Canada is that it's full of Indian savages who scalp and torture people, and it's full of former Tories who like to help Indians to scalp and torture people. So they get into Canada and they look around and they see some nice farms and some nice villages, and they start to scatter and go and loot, and occasionally set fire to things because they like to see things burn. So the American government says, not our fault. But they never court-martialed any of the officers who should have controlled this, and they never court-martialed any of the soldiers who engaged in this behavior. And the American troops end up retreating because it makes Canadians very angry when you burn their farms or loot their farms. And so as the war goes on, more and more Canadians get off the fence and fight very fiercely to repel these people. So the reason why they're coming in and burning and looting and then leaving is because the burning and looting offends so many Canadians that the resistance becomes much fiercer and they are compelled to retreat.
I want to follow up on the Aboriginal angle you talked about there, because there are some absolutely chilling passages in your book of descriptions of mass slaughters, of scalpings, and then on the other hand, of native warriors making a huge ruckus outside a fort.
Right.
British commanders saying, I can't hold them back, and Americans giving up without a shot being fired.
Right.
Talk about how that worked its way through this war.
Okay, that's a good point. Now, the thing about scalping is that people on both sides is scalping. And indeed, some of the chief American troops in the invasion of Canada came from Kentucky. And the people of Kentucky at that time took pride in their fighting ability in the Indian style. And many of these people were very aggressive about collecting as many scalps as they possibly could. So British officers had at the start of the war persuaded their Indian warriors to give up their traditional practice of scalping, because they knew Americans made great propaganda hay out of the British use of Indian allies and the scalping practice. So, but then the very first scalp that was taken in the war was a Kentuckian killed an Indian and went and scalped him. Well, the Indians were so upset about this, they carried the body into the British military encampment and said, this is what the Kentuckians do, don't tell us ever again not to scalp. So both sides are scalping in this war. But most of the American troops were not Kentuckians. They came from New England, they came from upstate New York, they came from Pennsylvania. They did not have any previous experience with Indian warfare. They had grown up reading stories, horror stories about Indians as murderous savages. They're not trained, you put them into combat, they're in the woods in Canada, and they hear these shrieks and screams, which is what warriors do to work up their courage and to terrify the other side. And then they see these painted Indian warriors that are right out of the nightmares of these Americans. And a lot of these Americans at that point throw their guns down and run. Or they look for the nearest British officer and say, please accept our surrender and protect us. Now, not all do that, but a lot do it, particularly in the first year and a half of the war. So the British figure this out, and the First Nations people, leaders figure this out, and they start to conduct the war in a very theatrical fashion. displaying Indians, telling the Americans, I'm not sure I can control these people. If we capture you, I hope you like being burned at the stake. Now, they were playing this up. There was this one case where Native peoples captured an American officer and they were playing around, tormenting him. Nothing particularly serious. And this guy was terrified. He turned to a British officer and said, please, I'll do anything, you know, get me free. And the British officer goes to the Indians and say, you can't kill this guy. Well, you've got to keep him as a prisoner. And the Indians say, don't worry, we just want to scare him so he won't come back.
Okay. I want to mention a few battles here, which I suspect the audience will be familiar with, and then I want you to give me some sort of quick hits on what the significance of those battles are and why we remember them 200 years later. October 1812, one of the very first and most important battles, Queenston Heights. Significance of that battle?
Significance is it's the second American attempt to invade Canada. It's almost as disastrous as the first. In the morning, the Americans cross the river, Niagara River, capture Queenston Heights. Things are looking good. Brock leads a counterattack, gets killed. British have to retreat, and then they mount a second counterattack later in the afternoon, sweep the Americans from the hill, and First Nations people were essential to that particular victory, and it's 900 Americans end up prisoners, including 23 Irish Americans, who are then held hostage for much of the rest of the war under the threat of being hung as traitors.
April 1813, the destruction of Fort York here in Toronto. Significance of that?
Significance of that, so lots of significance. One is that there's an explosion of a magazine and all of the stone comes collapsing down on an American unit, killing the general officer, Zebulon Pike, who was a great hero in America. And American troops and officers believed this was very dirty play. It was unintentional. It didn't intend to kill all those Americans, but even if it had, that was the point of war. But Americans thought that this was cheating. So they got into York, and the town fathers of York thought they had negotiated an understanding with the American commanders that they would control their troops and not loot the town. But the troops got out of control, and they pretty thoroughly looted the town. And some of them went into the Parliament buildings and claimed that they found a human scalp stuck on the wall next to the official mace, which was a symbol of British government. Now, it's pretty implausible that there was a scalp tacked to the wall of the Parliament buildings. But people don't act on what's true, they act on what they believe is true. So these sailors then got out of control and burned the buildings, the Parliament buildings. And then this is something that's considered a great outrage and will be one of the inspirations for the British determination to burn public buildings when they capture Washington, D.C. in the next year of the war.
If you grew up in Hamilton and you went to high school, one of the places that you used to go to neck with your best girl in a car was a place where they had one of the most brutal battles in the War of 1812. July 1814, Lundy's Lane. That's a true story about Hamilton, incidentally. I don't know that from personal experience, I've heard.
Did you grow up in Hamilton?
I did indeed.
Okay.
Yes. Significance of Lundy's Lane.
Well, I never would have predicted that in the future Lundy's Lane would be a center of romance. Lundy's Lane, when it occurred in the summer of 1814, was the bloodiest battle up to that point in the war. It was a night battle. Night battles are all battles are confusing. Sometimes you read these accounts, war accounts, and it seems so neat. Generals order this unit there and that unit there, and it looks like you're playing a board game, and you know where all the pieces go. Battles, as far as I can tell, never work that way, because they're absolutely chaotic in all the variables that are in play. And there's just dense smoke over the battlefield, and there's thunderous sound, and people are scared. And inevitably orders go askew, and people do what they're not supposed to do, or they find the landscape's different than they expect. So every battle's chaotic and gets out of the control of its commanders pretty quickly. Then you add the feature of night. This battle began at dusk, and the two sides were so determined to hammer each other, they just kept fighting through the night. And so you got confusion, and you can't tell from the language who you're fighting against. And so units got mixed up. One of the British generals thought he was among his own troops, and it turns out he was among American troops, and they grabbed him. This happened to some Americans too. There are points where people were shooting. It turns out they were shooting at people of their own side. It's just a hideous battle. And at the end of the battle, the two armies are just so exhausted, they're both, staggered down to their respective sides of the hill. And so this hill, which is symbolic as to who's going to claim victory, is there. And there are some broken down cannon there, which were prime trophies of battle. So whoever in the morning can go and reclaim the hill and grab those cannon and take them off is going to claim victory. But the Americans were so broken down by this battle that their two top generals had both been crippled with wounds. And it fell to the third in command, who was a cautious man, who said, this army's shattered. It's not worth it for those cannon to go and risk the entire destruction of this army. So they retreated all the way down to Fort Erie. And the crippled commander of the American army was just cursing his replacement the whole way because he wanted the honor of those cannon. And the British managed to get the cannon then and to claim victory. But the Americans would never concede that it was a British victory on that day. But given the enormous carnage on both sides, just the butcher's bill, and what the military surgeons, it fell mostly to British military surgeons, because the Americans had to leave most of their most grievously wounded soldiers behind. And they're just basically amputating limbs one after another, and they're doing this in barns. They don't have sanitary conditions for hospitals, and they've got to amputate just as quickly as possible. It's the grimmest possible conditions. So it's almost meaningless who can claim victory when you are left with such carnage on both sides.
Here are the numbers. 171 dead, 572 wounded on the American side, 84 British troops dead, 559 wounded on the British side. Lundy's Lane. One more battle. You're doing very well. He had laryngitis when he walked in here tonight. I'm surprised you've done as well as you have.
Thank you.
Let's do one more battle. This one was strange because I think we've been taught by history that because it happened after the war was technically over, it wasn't all that important. But it certainly was to the career of a guy named Andrew Jackson. Battle of New Orleans, February 1815. Significance thereof.
Well, it's January of 1815.
January, okay.
Yeah. There's this great myth that the battle was fought after the peace had been resolved. And the reason it's a myth is that there had been a peace treaty signed in December of 1814. But that treaty did not go into effect until it's ratified by both sides. And it's stipulated there in the treaty. And the treaty is not ratified by the United States until the middle of February of 1815. So the Battle of New Orleans is while the war is still going on. Now, that feature was put in the treaty because the British didn't trust the Americans. They had a track record of negotiating treaties in Europe and then rewriting them in Washington. And the British said, you have to accept this as a package, no changes, and when you do that and ratify it, the war ends. The Battle of New Orleans is one of the most important battles in the history of North America. Because if the British had grabbed control of New Orleans, it controls the mouth of the Mississippi, the vast watershed at the heart of North America. It was a region that was very, very tenuously part of the United States at that point. Louisiana's population was mostly French. And there were a lot of slaves there who didn't like being slaves. It was a situation in which the British could have wreaked a great deal of havoc on the American economy and the American political system if the war had gone on. Also, it's such a one-sided American victory, massive casualties on the British side and almost none on the American. And it's the favorite battle of Americans because the British do exactly what American stereotype of the British says they'll do, which is to mass nice red masses of men and charge an entrenched position of Americans who simply have to shoot at them. This is one of very few battles where that happened. But it did happen at New Orleans, and it makes Andrew Jackson, the American commander's reputation, and he will become a president of the United States. But it also has a very long, enduring impact on British thinking about war in North America. They become quite clear that they don't want to invade North America ever again, if they can help it. And it's one of the prime reasons then that the British over the next 2 years will abandon their Indian allies within the United States. When the Americans start to put the screws to those allies, and those Indian allies turn to the British in Canada and say, we helped you, why aren't you helping us? And they would say, these officials would say to them, we'd love to help you, but we have orders from London to stand down, sorry. And one of the prime reasons they have orders to stand down is the British don't want another war with the United States because of that one-sided crushing defeat they suffered at New Orleans.
Alan, let's do 2 more questions, you and me, 2 more quick ones, and then you can see there's a microphone in the middle of the room. We'll get everybody else involved who wants to ask a question. You know, apropos of Mr. Ainsley's funny story off the top, let me ask you, who won the War of 1812?
You know, I thought that would be the first question I would be asked, yeah.
That'd give away the ending right off the top. I wasn't going to do that.
Right. Well, I have to leave this room, and I'm outnumbered. It's certainly clear that Canadians and the British and their First Nations allies won the war to defend Canada. The Americans, however, won the war to conquer the West. And the peace treaty is this very important pivot. The peace treaty really betrays the interests of Canada and First Nations peoples. First Nations peoples had been promised that the British would help them set up a buffer zone within what had been the United States, south of the Great Lakes, what's now Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, to be an Indian country. And that would have served as a buffer zone to help to protect Canada, because that cluster of Indian peoples would be affiliated with British Canada. Now we could play the counterfactual issue. How would Canada have been different if those Indian peoples had been associated with Canada and eventually had become part of Canada, and inevitably many of those lands would have been settled by immigrants coming via the St. Lawrence, and you would have had Canadian provinces in Wisconsin and Michigan. That would have been greatly enhanced, kind of the depth of the temperate zone for Canada, and would have greatly increased Canada's position in the world. Now, the United States manages to get the British to abandon the buffer zone and to abandon plans to give the British a monopoly of naval power in the Great Lakes, which they were also seeking, which also would have enhanced Canada's security in the future. And then when the Americans after the war are able to basically crush Indian resistance within these generous boundaries the United States secures, it's going to guarantee that the United States will be the dominant power in North America and will be in a position in the 20th century to become the greatest superpower in the world.
Last question. Why is this war not named something more original?
Well, they couldn't come up with an alternative. Sometimes Americans would say it's the second war for American independence. But that was a hard sell. And sometimes they'd call it the Canadian War. But the fact was they were fighting it on the high seas, the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic coast as well. And so they settled on the War of 1812, even though it's a war of 1813 and 1814 and 1815 too. So we're now stuck with it.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your turn now. We're going to take questions for Alan Taylor on his book. There's a microphone in the middle there. So by all means, snuggle up to the mic. And if you like, tell us who you are and where you're from, and then fire away.
Bojo, Padabin Migazekwe Dijnikaz, Dodam Bene Nipissing Nadanjaba. My English name is Catherine Brooks. I would like you to tell why Tecumseh was able to successfully create a large group of different kinds of Indian nations together to fight in the War of 1812. And secondarily, I'd like you to tell about the role of the Nipissings.
Okay, just for me, I suspect everybody knows, but just in case, remind us who Tecumseh was, and then to her question.
Well, Tecumseh, his ethnicity was Shawnee, but he had a vision of pan-Indian unity. He wanted to unite all of, I'm sorry I keep slipping using Indian, but that's what we use on the U.S. side, First Nations peoples, Indian peoples throughout North America. He wasn't the first person to have this vision. It goes back to a leader among the Ottawa named Pontiac, who'd also pushed for this back in the 1760s. Tecumseh was an extremely charismatic man, an extraordinary public speaker. He was a man of extraordinary courage. And that was essential if you're going to inspire other warriors to go into combat with you. And so he had a reputation and a lot of clout. And he used that on behalf of this idea of Native peoples setting aside their differences with one another and uniting to defend their homeland as a common homeland rather than many separate homelands. And he also benefited from his brother, Tecumseh, who was a prophet, a visionary, who had had visionary encounters with the Master of Life, who had given a message saying that Native peoples had to unite. And they had to change their ceremonies, and they had to revitalize their traditional way of life if they were to survive as distinct peoples.
He was killed in battle, though, right?
Tecumseh was killed in battle on the Battle of the Thames in the fall of 1813. So his death is a crushing blow to the dream of this pan-Indian or pan-First Nation concept, which is something that the United States is committed to destroying.
How about a word about the Nipissing?
You know, I know next to nothing that's specific about the Nipissing.
They fought in the War of 1812
yes,
with Tecumseh. But it was also motivated because there was a huge massacre, wasn't it? The reasons the Indians participated was because the Americans were killing them.
Well, there was an attack on a place called Prophetstown. Now, there was a long history of Americans attacking native villages and committing atrocities. Now, one of the attacks is on a place called Prophetstown in what's now Indiana, which was where Tecumseh and Tecumseh lived. And there's a lot of people who are killed in that attack. And the American commander on that day was William Henry Harrison. And William Henry Harrison would, 2 years later, be the commander at the Battle of the Thames and the battle that killed Tecumseh. Tecumseh had not been in the Battle of Tippecanoe, which is what the battle will derive the name from, near Prophetstown. He'd been away, which is one of the reasons why Harrison was able to capture that village. But he is at the Battle of the Thames, and Harrison and his men will succeed in killing him there.